Security, guy in the first aisle. So I had this nifty visual presentation, but I'm a little bit nervous about using it, so you're going to have to listen to me and not look at the screen. I apologize in advance. A little audience participation. How many of you over the last year or two have said, boy, I have confidence that no matter who wins, we're going to be all right? Raise your hands. How many of you over the last year or two have said to yourself, this is exactly what I want to see in my politics or my country? Anybody raise your hands? I have. Yeah, there we go. There's one in every crowd. We're in a weird time. We're in a time when people have not much confidence in our politics and our country, where we've got a sour attitude about things that we shouldn't have a sour attitude about. And we seem to think that we've never been here before. We're really just sort of wringing our hands and saying, how are we going to be able to survive? And my message to you is, no matter how bad you think it is today, it's been worse before. And it does us no good as a country to think that we are someplace that we've never been. Many people in this room can remember the last time our politics was broken and our country looked like it was going to fall apart. The 1960s and the 1970s. We began the 1960s with the country in turmoil over the issue of race, sexual freedom, and an unpopular war. And remember what it was like. Remember what it was like. The peaceful protests in the South in the 1950s had given way to state-sanctioned violence in many instances. We've got an author here who's written about John Lewis, who was nearly beaten to death at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965. And we were as a country deeply divided. And by 1964, that disagreement broke through in Harlem, when Harlem went up. 1965, again, more protests around the country and our big cities, including Watts. The center of a great city burned for 6 or 7 days. 1966, Chicago, Cleveland, San Francisco. And then came the long, hot summer of 1967, in which 163 American cities were struck by urban violence. Then April 4th, 1968. You probably remember where you were when you heard that Martin Luther King had been gunned down in a motel in Memphis, Tennessee. And within hours, 130 American cities are ablaze and 47 of our fellow Americans die. 2 months later, Robert Kennedy is gunned down in a hotel celebrating his victory in the Democratic presidential primary. And on the ballot that year is a racist, a segregationist, and he wins 5 states in the Electoral College. And 4 years later, George Corley Wallace runs 1.5% behind in the popular vote in the Democratic presidential primary, losing to the ultimate victor, George McGovern. Then we had the war. Protests began in 1964, and by 1965, they were routine. In 1967, 35,000 people stormed the Pentagon in an attempt to shut down the war. 1968, 20,000 people are in Grant Park in Chicago attempting to shut down the Democratic Convention. I'm a young kid 4 years later at the 1972 Republican Convention in Miami Beach, and I have to fight my way through a mob that's being tear gassed, and the President of the United States, the President, cannot be driven into the convention hall. He has to be brought in by a helicopter because demonstrators have blocked all the approaches to the convention hall. 1970, by 1970, it is routine for the National Guard to be called out, and at Kent State University, 4 students are shot. And with a matter of hours, 350 American campuses have been taken over by an estimated 2 million student protesters, and many of those universities do not open back up that spring. And in an 18-month period in 1971 and 1972, there are 2,500 domestic bombings by left-wing groups, largely the Weather Underground, aimed at recruitment offices, selective service offices, and federal government buildings. 2 presidents are driven from office. One by the burden of an unpopular war, Lyndon Johnson, and another one by a second-rate burglary. And the country's politics looks broken. And violence has become routine. John Kennedy, November 1963. King, March of 1968. His brother, Robert Kennedy, a few weeks later. George Wallace, running in 1972, is shot 5 times and carries those bullets in his broken body until the day he ultimately dies, decades later. Gerald Ford, within the matter of a few days, is twice attacked in California. And one of them, literally within a matter of feet, and the pistol misfires. Otherwise, he would have been dead. And who can forget the new president, within days of being sworn in, less than 3 months in office, who was shot and nearly killed outside the Washington Hilton, Ronald Reagan. Now, our politics look broken, and the country was desperate. And we elected a good man from Georgia, a good Christian man who seemed like he was the guy who would restore dignity and honor to the White House, but he turned out to be weak and ineffective. He had a storied life after his presidency, but at the time we didn't think the presidency was all that good because we had double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates, double-digit unemployment, and the Russians were on the move around the world, and it looked like the American century was at an end. There was talk of malaise, of guys in cardigan sweaters telling us to turn down the heat and get prepared for a cold winter. Gas lines in '74, you remember those? And our politics was broken. And in 1980, we had a choice. Were we going to take the guy that was in there, well-meaning as he was, or were we going to replace him with that guy who people said was not really trustworthy because he was far too extreme, but he kept talking in the single debate of the 1980 presidential election about how he was governor of California, the most populous state in the Union, which back then had a slightly different reputation. And he kept saying that question, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And we took a bet, and the country turned around. But let's not kid ourselves. For the better part of 2 decades, we were broken as a country, and our politics was particularly broken. And it's not the only time. Think about the 1930s. We have 1 out of every 4 of our fellow Americans is without a job. And we have populism on the left and the right. On the right, it's Huey Long. Every man a king, he says. He talks about confiscating wealth, and he talks class hatred until he's assassinated in 1935. And on the left, we have Father Coughlin. Excuse me, I got it wrong. Huey Long's on the left, Father Coughlin's on the right, broadcasting every day with 50,000 watts from Detroit, and his message is the Depression is a result of the Jews. It is the Jews and Wall Street that have put our country in this dangerous place. We have the German Bund holding a rally in Madison Square Garden and filling it to the rafters. Behind the speaker's podium is a drawing of George Washington, but off to the sides are pictures of Adolf Hitler. We have hundreds of thousands of members of the Communist Party of the United States of America marching through the streets of New York, and the CPUSA attempting to acquire agents of influence, people who could work on behalf of Soviet communism. There's a wonderful memoir of the era by the journalist Eric Severide. Remember him? It's a wonderful memoir. He says, every day, the headlines spoke of riots, of millions thrown out of work, of mass migrations by the desperate. Another historian, Wendy L. Wall, the late 1930s are, quote, marked by sit-down strikes, violent repression of workers, and attacks by vigilante groups on Jews, Catholics, racial minorities, and leftists. And our country looks like it's coming apart. People are desperate, but we are held together by a guy who cannot stand in his own 2 feet. We have nothing to fear, he said, but fear itself. I wrote a book about the Gilded Age. Strongly recommend it to you. It's got sex, violence, backstabbing, betrayal. Everybody has a cool nickname. We need to bring back this cool nickname thing. Yes. The leader of the Republican bosses is called the Easy Boss, Thomas Collier Platt, former senator from New York. His lieutenant is the blonde boss, 32-year-old Congressman William J. Larimer from the city of Chicago, who controls 20,000 Republican patronage jobs in Cook County, Illinois. And they call themselves the Combine. The guy who takes the Democratic nomination in a total upset is called the Boy Orator, the Platt, and he beats Richard Park Bland, who for 30 years has led the crusade for the free and unlimited coinage of silver, a cause he calls the cause of humanity itself, and his nickname is Silver Dick. Anyway, it must have meant something different back then. But if you think politics is broken today, go back to the Gilded Age, because they hate each other. They hate each other, and our politics is broken. We have 5 presidential elections in a row in which nobody gets 50% of the vote. In 3 of the 5 elections, the difference between the front runner and the second place finisher is less than 1 percentage point. And in 2 of the 5 elections, the winner of the Electoral College loses the popular vote. And they're fighting the Civil War only now in the halls of Congress and the White House. The most incredible presidential election is that of 1876. Everybody was sort of for Ulysses S. Grant, but by 1876, the old wounds had begun to fester and came out. On election night, the governor of the battleground state of New York, the key swing state in that election, how times have changed, Samuel Tilden is up by 252,666 votes over his Republican challenger, Rutherford B. Hayes. Only there's something weird going on, because the Electoral College votes of Louisiana, South Carolina, and Mississippi, or excuse me, Florida, are all in the Democratic column, which would be impossible, because a majority of the eligible voters in those 3 states are black men, overwhelmingly Republican because of the war, and yet somehow or another, the Democrats have supposedly won those 3 states. Almost immediately, evidence of widespread fraud begins to be discussed. Both parties dispatch their lieutenants, the members of Congress and senators, to the area to find out what's going on. Some of them arrive with suitcases full of money in order to grease the palms of local officials. Congress is supposed to take up this contested election under the Constitution, but it refuses to do so, and instead passes a special law that takes the issue of resolving what happened in those 3 states to a special commission made up of judges. And on March 2nd, 1877, they unanimously agreed to award the Electoral College votes of those 3 states to Hayes. And with them, he becomes President of the United States by a vote in the Electoral College of 185 to 184, and is sworn in 2 days later. Wow. And in order to be sworn in, he has to agree that he'll withdraw federal troops from the South in return for a pledge by Southern Democrats that they'll do everything they possibly can to guarantee black voting rights in the future, which turns out to be a hollow cause. In 1896, 60% of the eligible voters in Mississippi are black men, and the nominee of the party of Lincoln, William McKinley, gets 6% of the vote. There is no election after 1872 in which there is not wide-scale violence and intimidation aimed at black voters in the South and seen by everybody with clear eyes. It's divided government. Between 1873 and 1897, there are 4 years with a Republican president, House and Senate, 2 years with a Democratic president, House and Senate, and the rest of the time it's divided government, mostly with a Republican Senate and a Democratic House, and nothing gets done because they hate each other. When the Democrats take control of the House in 1874 by flipping 92 seats in the House, 56 of those new Democrats are former officials of the Confederacy. Generals, governors, including also the Vice President of the Confederacy, Stevens of Georgia, is sitting in the U.S. Congress. The only time something gets done is when outside events intrude. The President of the United States, James Garfield, is shot by a disgruntled office seeker months into his presidency, and Congress says, well, maybe we need to do something about that, and they pass the first civil service law. Democratic farmers in the South and Republican farmers in the West say, you know what, the railroads are screwing us. They're charging way too much to get our products to market, and the Congress finally passes the Interstate Commerce Commission and the first regulatory laws on railroads. But otherwise, nothing gets done. Anybody here from Iowa? Remember a couple years ago, they had the woman who got elected in southeastern Iowa called Mary Anna Miller Meeks, and she won by 7 votes. And Pelosi said, you know what, we maybe ought to think about having a special election commission to look into whether or not she was really elected. And they thought about it for a couple of days and said, you know what, we better not do that. Let's leave it up to the Iowans to figure that out. Because they remembered that in 1984, in the bloody 8th District of Indiana, the Republican who won on election night then had an election commission led by the Democrats in the House, and they looked at it and said, you know what, we don't think you actually won, and they kicked him out and replaced him with his Democrat opponent, and for the next couple of years in Congress, let's just say things were not happy. Guess how many times during the Gilded Age, the majority party in the U.S. House of Representatives found a member of the minority who had won by a small number of votes and phoning up an election challenge and kicked him out. Let's think about it for a moment. We're talking about a quarter of a century. We're talking about, essentially from 1874 until 1904 was the sort of the end point of all of this. So we're talking about 15 Congresses, 30 years. Each Congress is 2 years long. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to how many times it happened? 30? How about 62 times? In 1884, William McKinley, who has won re-election in the previous election by 7 votes, is kicked out, though there is absolutely no evidence of fraud in his swing Ohio district. And the only unusual thing about it is that 7 leading Democrats, including the first Democratic speaker in 18 years, vote to retain him as a mark of respect. But sometimes these are legitimate, particularly if it involved black Republicans from the South who won the election and then lost it in the count and had to be put in this way. But most of the time, it is sheer politics. We got the numbers, let's increase the numbers, and let's kick them out. The practice ends in 1904. John Soforth, a Democrat from Pueblo, Colorado, is under examination, and the special commission has been investigating the measure, and he's been paying attention to what's been going on in the election commission, and he rises to the floor of the House of Representatives and said, I've been paying careful attention to the meetings of the election commission on my race, and I've come to the reluctant conclusion that in my district, in the previous election, in 29 precincts, members of my own party engaged in illicit and illegal activity that resulted in my inappropriate election to the U.S. House, and I ask you, therefore, to join me today in voting to expel me from the House and replace me with my Republican opponent, which Congress immediately did. 2 years later, he was elected governor of Colorado, running on the slogan of Honest John. But that's what it took to end this. You think it's bad? We had the problem in 1888, the Republicans took the White House. They took the Senate by 1. They took the House of Representatives by 4. And back in those days, it was routine for members of the Congress to be, gone. Some of them were ill, some of them had to go home for the crops, some of them had business, but it was not unusual to have 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 members of the House absent on any given day. So the Democrats announced in 1889 that they will not allow a single bill to be passed through the House of Representatives so they can do it. If there are 4 or more Republicans absent from the floor of the House, they will call for a quorum call and refuse to answer the roll call. It was called the disappearing quorum. If there weren't the sufficient number of Republicans, a majority of the members of the Congress present, the Democrats would stand up and say, Mr. Speaker, we believe there's no quorum present. We call for a roll call. They'd call the roll. No Democrat would answer, and the bill would fail no matter what the outcome was. Back then, they were civilized. They swore them in March, and because there was no air conditioning in Washington, they sent them home until like October, November, and they'd come back, so the session began that year in October of 1889. And between October and November and December and January, virtually nothing got done because the Democrats would disappear the quorum. The Speaker of the House had enough. Thomas Brackett Reed, 6 foot 3 inches tall, about 300 pounds, looked something like a bowling pin with a walrus mustache painted on it. tough, smart, well-read, cynical, and knew how to use power. And on January 29th, 1890, he tells the sergeant-at-arms that there will be a vote that day. It was a vote on expelling a West Virginia Democrat who had lost the election on election day by 3 votes, and the Democratic governor took a precinct in which the Democrat had received 2 votes and said he actually got 12, thereby giving him the victory by 7. And so the Election Commission validated that it was a stolen election, and they're going to have a vote on it. And he tells the sergeant-at-arms, when the vote is called, take up arms and allow no member to depart the chamber. And on the inside of the chamber, the same chamber you see during a State of the Union address, the sergeant-at-arms line up. Outside, unbeknownst to those guys, there are people who are putting bars in the doors to block them. They have the vote. The Republicans prevail. A Democrat from Kentucky stands up and says, Mr. Speaker, I believe there's no quorum present. I call for a roll call. They call the roll. Not a single Democrat answers the roll call. They're all slapping each other on the back. They made it done. And with that, Reed turns to the clerk and says, the chair directs the clerk to show Mr. Jones present, Mr. Smith present, Mr. Wright present, Mr. Fall present, calls out the name of every Democrat he sees on the floor of the House, and all hell breaks loose. Every Democrat runs for the doors. One gets out. Constantine August of Rusk County, Texas, beats the crap out of the sergeant-at-arms and uses his cowboy boots to kick out the slats in the door to make good his escape. The Democrat who called for the roll call stands up and screams at Reed, under God and the Constitution, you have no right to count me present without my permission. To which Reed coolly answered, does the honorable gentleman deny he's present upon the floor of the House? This kicks off 3 days of debate as to whether or not the Speaker of the House has the right to do this. The issue is ultimately settled by the U.S. Supreme Court. But on the second day of the debate, another Texan makes a great contribution to the history of our United States Congress and its gentlemanly behavior. William Henry Hattie Martin, 6 foot 6 inches tall, thin as a rail, mean as a snake, fought the entire Civil War with the famed Hood's Brigade. He got his nickname when, after a battle, Robert E. Lee wanted to pay homage to the Hood Brigade and wrote and asked them to be to line up and let him ride in review. And as the sainted Robert Lee rode by, Howdy Martin stood up in his stirrups, took off his hat, and yelled at him, "Howdy!" Martin stands up and begins to inveigle against Speaker Reed. He tears into him, says the most ugly things. Finally, Reed says the honorable gentleman from Texas is out of order and recognizes another Democrat, Byram of Indiana. And with that, Martin walks off the floor, walks up to right beneath the Speaker's podium and begins to heckle Reed. Tyrant, sir, tyrant! Reed pays him no attention at all. Finally, after doing this for some measure of time, Martin stumbles off saying, there's no fight in him. And the next day, he shows up on the floor of the House of Representatives chamber, takes a seat where Jamie is, pulls out his 16-inch long Bowie knife and begins to methodically sharpen it on his boot heel in an attempt to menace the Speaker of the House. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but when Nancy Pelosi was no longer Speaker, I don't remember her doing that with her stilettos. I really don't. But that's the way it was for the entire quarter of a century, because they were still fighting the Civil War, only on the floor of the House and the Senate. How many of you remember the first time you had a history class and they talked about the coming of the Civil War and you saw the woodcut of Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina caning Charles Sumner of Massachusetts? 1856. Man, made a big impression on me. There's a brilliant book I strongly recommend it to you by Joanne Freeman. Trust me, this is, if you love American history, read Field of Blood. Brilliant historian at Yale, and she writes that this was the tail end of it. She says for 1830s and 1840s and 1850s that the tension and tempers inside the House were so strong that members of Congress routinely appeared on the floor of the House and Senate armed to the teeth. Pistols, derringers, knives, brass knuckles, special canes with weighted heads so they could beat each other. 1838, a Whig from Kentucky kills a Democrat from Maine in a duel. And you know what the issue is? Banking regulation. Oh, no. She says that we had 30 years in which the opinions about issues like that were so keenly felt and so deep that the country was at war with itself long before it actually went to war. She writes, the nation didn't slip into disunion, it fought its way into it. And this was not mostly, for that 30 years, over the central issue that we now look back at, which is the enslavement of 4 million Americans in violation of the Declaration of Independence. This was about, for God's sake, banking regulation or internal improvements. You know, this was not, incidentally, the first time that we had potential violence or had violence on the floor of the House. It's not 1856. You want to guess when the first fist fight is on the floor of the House of Representatives or in the halls of the Senate? How about January 3rd, 1798? There's a debate over expelling a member from Tennessee who had acted inappropriately, and two men go at it. A Federalist named Roger Griswold from Connecticut, and a guy named Matthew Lyons from Vermont. And they get into an argument on the floor, and Griswold feels insulted by Lyon, who's paying no attention to him. He's trying to engage him in a colloquy on the floor of the House, and Lyon claims he didn't recognize that he was trying to do that, so he ignores him, and Griswold says something to him for being ignored, and Matthew Lyon responds by spitting in his face. For the rest of his political career as a member of Congress from Vermont and later Kentucky, his nickname is Spitting Lion. But Griswold, who's about this tall, decides to get his return fire. And on February 15th of 1798, members of the Congress it's a cold day, they're warming themselves by the fireplaces. Griswold comes in with a cane and appears to be limping across the floor and finds himself at the fireplace where Lyon is warming himself. And Griswold is being accompanied by General Daniel Morgan of the 1st District of Virginia, a famous Revolutionary War hero, a big, tall guy. And when Griswold gets up to the fire next to Lyon, he straightens up, takes the club, and begins beating the crap out of Lyon. Members of the Federalist and Democratic Republican parties begin to try and separate the two men, but General Morgan holds them at bay until finally Griswold has done enough to beat up Lyon, and the incident ends. But it's 1798, for God's sake. When was the first stolen presidential election? We had one, 1828, or at least the loser who thought he was the winner said it was stolen. On election day, it's a four-way race. Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, and the Secretary of the Treasury, William Crawford. And on election day, the guy in front is Jackson, 41% of the vote. 11 of 20 states vote for him, and he has 99 electoral votes, but he's 33 short. And it goes to the Congress to decide. Each state has one vote, and on February 9th of 1825, John Quincy Adams, the number 2 guy, who had 84 electoral votes, is elected president by a vote of 13-7. Each state has one vote. 4 states that had been carried by Jackson vote for John Quincy Adams. And for the next 4 years, Jackson and his allies talk about the corrupt bargain that silenced the voice of the American people, that stole the White House for John Quincy Adams. 1800. Remember the sainted Thomas Jefferson? What a man he was. Author of the Declaration of Independence, at the age of 81, founded the University of Virginia, author of the Statute of Religious Liberty, 3rd President of the United States. Do you remember that his election was one of the ugliest in the history of America? A great historian, James Roger Sharp, said, quote, the campaign was, quote, marked by vicious personal attacks, portents of doom and disaster if one or the other of the opponents were to be elected, and scurrilous rumors of betrayal and intrigue pervaded every aspect of the contest. Jefferson himself participated. He was not a saint. He paid for a notorious journalist named Caldwell to be hired by the Richmond newspaper so he could write the most vicious and nasty personal attacks on John Adams and then circulate them to other Democratic Republican papers around the country to be reprinted. But this was one of the ugliest contests, and guess what? Do you remember it ended in a tie in the Electoral College? It ended in a tie, 73 for Jefferson and 73 for Adams. Now, this is not the way it's supposed to be. Actually, it was 73 for Jefferson and 73 for his running mate, Aaron Burr. Because back then you had 2 votes. You cast, the guy who got the most votes was president, and the guy who got the second most votes was the vice president. And so some of Jefferson's supporters and Burr supporters were supposed to throw away their votes. Some New Yorkers who were voting for Burr were supposed to throw away their vote to make certain Jefferson came in first. Jefferson thinks this is a done deal. He writes his son-in-law. I love Jefferson's letters to his son-in-law. He gives him all the secret stuff. So he says, we got some people in Georgia, they're going to take care of it. New York is okay, everything's hunky-dory. But the Electoral College meets and it's a tie. So the 2 men go to the Congress in February of 1801, February 12th to be precise, and the decision has to be made between these 2 people. And between November in the election and December in the Electoral College and February, Aaron Burr and the Federalists start talking about Burr stealing the presidency from his leader, Thomas Jefferson. And the Federalists dominate the lame duck Congress. In fact, there's a worry that the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson is going to lose it on the first ballot because one of the members of the Maryland delegation, a Democrat, is thought to be near death. And guess what? The opening day of their visit, a blizzard strikes Washington, D.C., and traffic is immobilized. And they have to carry Josephson of Maryland on a stretcher 2 miles through the blizzard, snow-filled streets of Washington, D.C. to deadlock the Maryland delegation, 4 Federalists and 4 Democratic Republicans. They vote at noon, and it's inconclusive because Vermont is deadlocked, 1-1. Maryland is deadlocked, 4-4. South Carolina is deadlocked, 4-4. So nobody has a majority. So they vote every hour, on the hour. In fact, they vote 27 times by the next noon. There's a wonderful diarist of the Times who talks about how they were in their sleeping blankets and their sleeping caps and lying on tables and lying on sofas and lying on the floor. And every hour or so it would be, gentlemen, it is time to vote. And they would vote hour after hour after hour. So on the second day at noon, they say, look, let's slow this sucker up and see if we can't come to an agreement. Remember when we had 15 ballots to elect Kevin McCarthy and how bad that was supposed to be? Yeah. They have 27, and they vote once a day for the next 5 days, and each day till the last, it is the same inconclusive total. And finally, on the final day, February 17th, it breaks by the intervention of an unlikely figure, Alexander Hamilton. He's previously written a letter to James Baird, the sole congressman from Delaware and a leader in the Federalist Party, and said to him, I hate him. I hate them both. I hate him. But he said, at least Jefferson has a concern for, quote, his own reputation, while Burr is a, quote, man of extreme and irregular ambition, and we, the Federalists, quote, must share in the blame and disgrace, end quote, that will come if he gets elected president. So go for the lesser evil. And on the 37th ballot, Baird takes a walk. He convinces the Federalists from Vermont and Maryland and South Carolina to take a walk. And on the 37th ballot, on February 17th, Thomas Jefferson is elected President of the United States and sworn into office less than 2 weeks later. So don't tell me that somehow or another we've been on a wonderful ride throughout history and we're suddenly in a place where we've never been before when our politics stinks and everything looks like it's broken. Don't tell me that. Just do not. Now, what happened? Sometimes events intrude. We go into a war and the country rallies around somebody, whether it is Lincoln or Roosevelt. But most of the time what happens is that we have effective leaders who step forward, and most important of all, they are empowered by the good common sense of the American people. We're not happy We're not happy with our politics. And we're not happy particularly with all our politicians. And what happens is they hear that. They hear that. And they start to do things differently. And believe me, they are. You remember the infrastructure bill that Congress passed a couple years ago? Do you know the backstory on that? That was not a presidential thing. Every 5 years we have to reauthorize the Highway Trust Fund. And the House takes the lead in reauthorizing it one time, and 5 years later the Senate, and back and forth. They ping pong it. And the last time they had to do it in 2022, the House took the lead, and the House Democrat chairman came out with a version of the Highway Trust Fund bill. They generally, you know, there's little things on the edges. We're going to have some demonstration of unused urban rail corridors, or we're going to do a little bit more on urban mass transit, or we're going to do this little thing. But mostly it is, here's how much gas money we're going to get, and here's the formula to send it back to the states. And it's all done on the edges. Until 2022, the Democrat chairman said, no funds appropriated under this act may be used to increase capacity on any existing federal interstate highway or to create any new mile of federal interstate highway. Think about that for just a minute, particularly those of you who live in urban areas. And so Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans on the Transportation Committee said, are we going to wait for this piece of trash to come over here? Or are we going to do something about this? Because this is an embarrassment. This is the Highway Trust Fund. And so Democrat and Republicans came together and wrote a bill on reauthorizing the Highway Trust Fund. They said, you know what? That was sort of easy. We discussed it. We were gentlemen and ladies. We arrived at a bill. Look, we all keep talking about the need to build infrastructure. Can we agree upon a reasonable amount of money and a reasonable non-political process by which the government will determine what are priority projects for waterways and ports and intermodals and airports? Can we agree on a reasonable number? And they came up with, well, let's $300 billion over the next 10 years, $30 billion a year, and a process to do it, which has historically been used, and they passed that bill. The president didn't, it wasn't a high priority for him. In fact, at one point, the White House said, we don't want that bill to be brought up because we got this thing called Build Back Better, whatever the hell that was, and we were afraid that we'll undermine support for that. But why did it happen? It happened because Republicans and Democrats said, I came here to do something good for my country, and I'm not going to engage in political games. Not on a subject that I'm a member of a committee of and feel seriously about. We had a young senator, anybody here from Indiana? Todd Young says, I'm concerned about what would happen if China took Taiwan, the source of 90% of the chips that power our modern economy. And I want to do something about this before it's too late. And he heard that the Democratic chairman of the Senate Intel Committee had the same concern, so he goes over to him on the floor and says, can I come and have a cup of coffee with you and talk about something I think we're both concerned about? And they found out there were others, Senator Cornyn, a Republican of Texas, so-and-so, a Democrat from so-and-so. And they finally got a working group together and passed the CHIPS bill. Now, you can disagree if you want with the industrial policy. I got pluses and minuses. But the fact of the matter is these people said, I didn't come here to be measured by whether or not I'm being retweeted or getting invited to MSNBC or Fox. I came here to do something good for my state and my country, and I'm tired of it. So the good common sense of the American people is already being heard. We need to make them hear more of that. They need to hear from you. They need to hear from all of us. Because at the end of the day, what's going to get us out of the mess that we're in is by encouraging good men and women to step forward and run for office and do the thing that is right for the country, and help them when they do. Because that's the way we'll get out of it. We've gotten out of it before. And there'll be leaders who will rise in response to that and make themselves available to help us in this cause. But it all starts with us, and it starts with you. So when you're sitting there saying, oh my God, can you believe how crazy this or that is in politics, or how much I dislike the other side or love my side, but boy, things are really broken, just remember, if you think it's been bad today, it's been worse before, and we survived it. We'll survive this one as well. Thanks for having me.